Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event hosted by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. We're so excited to be hosting this conversation tonight because it's so critically important, and we're really looking forward to hearing from our speakers about what we can do to try and ensure a feminist build back from the COVID-19 crisis. Welcome to everyone for joining us, and thank you. We all know that women are bearing the brunt of the economic fallout of this pandemic, at the same time as domestic and caring responsibilities have gone through the roof. And of course, women disproportionately are among the frontline workers responding to the pandemic. As we start to look forward and societies think about how we're going to recover from COVID-19, it's clear that it's essential that a feminist approach is taken. But what would that look like? Last year, the Canadian government announced it would pursue a feminist intersectional response to the pandemic. And in Hawaii, Maui County became the first place in the world to pass legislation that commits to a feminist economic recovery plan. We're going to hear much more about this evening from our two fantastic speakers. I'll just briefly introduce our speakers before letting them speak for themselves. First of all, we have Kara Jabola-Corolas, who's the Executive Director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, a statewide feminist government agency that works towards equality for women and girls by acting as a catalyst for positive change. Kara is the founder of AF3IRM Hawaii, a native and immigrant-led feminist activist organization. And also we have Anjum Sultana. She is the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at YCA Canada, the country's largest and oldest gender equity organization. She is leading the first nationally focused feminist economic recovery plan of its kind. Anjum was also named a Global Women of Distinction by the NGO Committee of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. So I'm going to turn over to our speakers to introduce the important work that they've been doing before I ask some questions. Kara, are you ready to go?
Aloha, everyone. I'm going to just quickly share my screen, so give me a second to throw it up. And we are good. Hopefully, there we go. So I'm so pleased to meet you. Thanks for being here. I want to share over the next, around 10 minutes, a little bit of our story, what it means to have a feminist economic recovery, what it entails, and what we've done with it. More importantly, how has it manifested concretely? And for me, the story is interwoven with the story of the dominant recoveries that have come forward. And I really think, I was thinking about how these stories are intertwined and had a flashback to my, a story that relates to my paternal grandfather. I swear this will tie into everything. But my grandfather was a textbook case of an accountant. No knock to the profession. I'm a lawyer, so I'm no one to talk. But he was also a veteran who participated in the carpet bombing of Manila, which ironically, my other grandfather barely survived, but he was very proud of that. And I didn't know much more about him because he died, unfortunately, and was diagnosed with cancer when I was 10 years old. And that last year that he was alive, the adults erected this kind of cancer firewall around him. So none of the grandkids were allowed to speak with him or call him during that time, which is, that year when you think of all of the biographical factoids that you want to pull out of your relative that you're so interested to learn about. So, but what happened? What got me through that year was that I was told he had written me a letter. And I clung to the idea that he had thought to give me that final moment of intimacy with him. So I waited and I waited for that letter, and I was given it after he passed away. And I finally read it and my heart dropped. The whole thing was typed except for one line where he had scribbled in my name. So immediately I realized that it was a letter for all the grandkids. but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the entire letter was about explaining compound interest and different schemes to save money and create infinite wealth. It was kind of like that scene in the Christmas Story. I don't know if you know the classic American Christmas cult classic, but when Ralphie decodes his commercial or this game from one of his favorite shows, and it's a crummy commercial. And that letdown really reminded me of the letdown that I had when I was reading some of the dominant plans that first came out, because it was this capitalistic, materialistic, soulless document that really wasn't what we needed in that moment. And it had that same framing. I mean, it's not just a random thing, right? I think back then I didn't understand it. But I realize now that this is why we call capitalism a pathology. And when the dominant plans came out in Hawaii from our kind of mainstream economists, professional economist block, they never contained the word women. They did not mention childcare. None of these scaffolds of the economy that are so crucial to a successful recovery or just to meet the needs of women in Hawaii. So the first plan, which was released a little bit over a year ago outside of government in Hawaii, that was, or would have been the blueprint, really advocated a recovery propelled by capital accumulation and belt tightening. So similar themes, right? It was a pretty useless document from our point of view. And so what I got to do that I didn't get to do to my grandfather's letter was write a response. And I was lucky enough to have a community of women, of feminists, who were already consolidated around the theory and the activism and knew that we had to put something out before we were written out of our state's economic future. So it's our anniversary this week. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it and get to another slide now. So what makes it unique? So it was an official government plan, and it was explicitly feminist because we knew that if we didn't counteract patriarchy, that it would default to disadvantaging and marginalizing women. And it's also unique in that it eschews Western and liberal feminism strands. I'll get to that when we go into the principles. But Hawaii, for those of you who may not know, is an Indigenous and Asian majority state. And so our plan was very firmly rooted in Indigenous knowledge and ideology and visions for a better future for Hawaii. The majority of those who co-created it with me from the community were either Indigenous, Native Hawaiian, Black, or Asian Pacific Islander. And it was really meant to be an example of participatory democracy at a time when governments are using the crisis to excuse a lack of transparency, to increase militarization, and to sever off the public from decision-making. So here are some of the principles. Intersectionality has been so vital, especially for us women of color, to be seen in these conversations and in policy making. But we wanted to add to that and focus on confluence, because a lot of the times we think about different systems as different. It sets us up to think that, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy just bump into each other or might overlap in certain people's lives. We wanted to focus instead on the fact that they are one common project and one system. We wanted to reject commodification, so to decommodify this trend towards commodification of personal space, intimacy, and care. We also wanted to use our recovery to facilitate the end of the gendered division of labor. So there is a system, right? There are systems that make it logical for men to do certain forms of work and to value certain forms of work in entire industries based on who is doing that work. And that's something that we wanted to eliminate because it's a legacy of colonization, the rigid gender roles that influence who has access to capital and therefore survival. The fourth principle is Aina back. Aina is the Native Hawaiian concept and term for land. And so it was very important for us to go beyond land acknowledgements and that kind of performative approach to Native Hawaiian well-being and sovereignty. And so we want to give land, money for housing, and a pro rata 20% share of funding to Native Hawaiians first. We also want to demilitarize. There's a lot of talk about where is the money going to come from. Hawaii is staunchly a military and tourism-based economy, as well as luxury development. The money is there, and we can avoid austerity and fund a recovery by demilitarizing, as well as under other alternatives. We also wanted to move beyond, right? It's about, well, we need women at the table. We have a lot of women at the table in Hawaii. We're not at parity by any means. We are far from it, but it's really useless if they're not feminist, if they're not pro-women and critical of these systems of power. So we want to push structures and practices that allow power to shift. We also wanted to facilitate the building of infrastructure. You've heard a lot, I'm sure, about care infrastructure. There's so much talk about that in our space, at least. And so socialized mothering, so shared responsibilities between others outside of women, and create an actual maternal and birthing people system of care in the US, which I don't know where all of you are from, but you may have. You're probably far ahead of us anyway. Childcare, education, and healthcare. So those are just some of the key principles that then were articulated in different policies. So as I close, I just want to talk for a second about what has happened out of this. So every single county in Hawaii has passed legislation committing to following and funding a recovery that is equitable for women and follows these principles. We have one county left, Honolulu, that is about to hear the bill. We also have a statewide task force that our state legislature is poised to create. We're in the final phase of the legislative process, which would aim to create all the tools necessary to implement this plan. So the full cycle of data collection, disaggregating data, assessment tools, and institutionalize those and bake them into how we do government in Hawaii, which is really important. A couple other things, some examples of, we've created tech access in a way that we want to model. So we gave hundreds of thousands of dollars of free laptops to single mothers and specifically Pacific Islanders without any type of application or conditions. One woman even called the police on us because she thought it was too good to be true. But that is one thing, one example of one of the many things that we've done to, try to balance the scales as people cope with the crisis, particularly women and gender diverse people. So I'll end there. I am so excited just to be a part of this plan because it's not just a new direction for the economy, but it's a new direction for feminism in the United States. And I hope that we have a great conversation after this. So thank you so much, everybody. Aloha.
Thank you so much, Cara. That was wonderful. Anjan, would you like to follow?
Yes, absolutely. And that was just wonderful. And I will say it's such a pleasure to be on this panel, Cara, and what you and your team have done has really influenced the work that we've been doing here in Canada and also I would say in many parts of the world. So thank you for your vision. Thank you for what you brought to the world. And I think even beyond the US, I think this is going to really set the stage for some transformation of feminism here in Canada and I imagine beyond. So I will say I am definitely fangirling by being a part of this panel with you and yeah, glad to kind of share the Canadian experience. So what I'll do is I will share my screen for a second here. And let me just bring it up. Okay, so The work that we've been doing is very much influenced by the incredible work that has been done in Hawaii. And for us, when we saw that plan come out back, I believe in April and a year ago, we were really we saw this as what exactly we needed to do, because we can no longer just address issues and address the symptoms of systemic racism, systemic sexism. We really need to get at the root cause. And for us, policy was one of the key places where we can make that difference at a large scale. So I want to share a bit about our organization and how the work that we were doing on the ground influenced the process for this plan. I work at YWCA Canada, and we work in 9 provinces and 2 territories across the country. And we've been working as an organization for the last 151 years. So we have been doing work around supporting communities in times of crisis for many generations. And I'll say because of this is not the first pandemic we've experienced. So as we were thinking about how do we address this current moment, we took a lot of lessons from the 1918 flu and what were some of the things that we did there. And what was clear is that in times of crisis, what matters more than anything is care and community and really going back to those roots. And for us, we really see that work that we do in community informing our national advocacy for, our hope that people-powered systemic change that we are seeking. And so for us, when the world called COVID a pandemic back on March 11th of 2020, our YWCA started to mobilize and figure out how could they support their communities. And they were doing a lot of things such as supporting essential workers with childcare, doing housing and housing programs and shelters for people in need, and also looking at how do we deal with this economic crisis. And as I'll share in a bit, who was most impacted and how do we serve them? So, for this presentation, I have some 3 key messages. One, for Canada's recovery, and I would say many nations, it's important to have an explicit intersectional gendered approach. And to Kara's point, it's not enough to have a gender lens. It needs to be looking at this through anti-oppression lens as well. And for us, we can't have a recovery without centering women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. And so they need to be not only at the decision-making table, but also in the evaluation of what was the plan and what was actually the success. And for us, what we've been pushing here in Canada is we really want Canada to step up and demonstrate that it can play a leadership role. And it has the potential to be supporting others in what a feminist recovery could look like. And so what did we see in Canada? So last year around this time, we saw just devastation in terms of which jobs were lost because of which sectors were impacted by pandemic lockdown measures. So hospitality, tourism, retail services, dramatic losses, and who works in those sectors? Disproportionately women. So in March of last year, 63% of the job losses in Canada were experienced by women. A year later, the story is not that much better. There has been some recovery, but it's been slower for women, and 100,000 women have actually permanently left the labor force because of the pandemic, because of the rise in unpaid care work, because of the lack of recognition for the incredible work that women are providing to society. And we've actually seen 12 times as many mothers compared to fathers have exited the labor market because of childcare duties, for example. So we're seeing, COVID is really impacting women in the workplace through economic losses. At the same time, they're on the front lines. And in Canada, 56% of women workers are working something called the 5 C's. So this is work in caring, cashiering, catering, cleaning, clerical. These are the front lines of the COVID response. And who is on the front lines? It's women. But despite being essential workers, they're not getting essential protections. So currently, I'm based in Toronto, also known as Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 territory. And today, our government announced a stay-at-home measure for the next 4 weeks. And when we think about it, this could have been avoided if we invested in things like personal protective equipment for women majority sectors, paid sick leave, decent pay. And so we're seeing their labor is essential, but they're not getting what they need from society. And also, for us, what we've also seen the disconnect is who is on the front lines and who's actually in positions of leadership. So that's something where we've seen that disconnect. And I think for this audience, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, I think this is something we really need to talk about for the next crisis. How do we ensure the front lines and who's in leadership tables, there's some alignment there. So at the same time, we've seen the impact of COVID in the home in the sense that unpaid care work has dramatically increased. Women in particular with school-age children have had to take on the triple burden of caregiving, being a teacher, if you will, homeschooling, and also if they are able to do remote work in the home or outside of it on the front lines. And because of this, we've actually seen unpaid care work lead to an increase in mental health concerns. So our friends at Oxfam Canada did a poll and found that 71% of Canadian women have increased stress, anxiety, depression because of all of this unpaid care work. And we're also seeing across the country, as in many jurisdictions, gender-based violence has been on the rise, anywhere from 20 to 30%. And in some of the shelters that we operate at YWCA, higher than that, 40%, 50%. So it's been quite difficult for frontline providers to support communities in need. And so in this environment where we were supporting communities on the front lines, we realized we need to think about how do we build back better and actually kind of put that on its head, because this crisis, who has been impacted is so different. We can't use the traditional playbook. We need something else to really address who has been most impacted. And so from that came the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan. This was a partnership between YWCA Canada and the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the University of Toronto. And this was authored by two young women of color. So I'm really glad to see in the audience, my fellow co-author Carmina is on the line and here as well. And something we're quite proud of is this was written by two young women of color, and everything from tip to tail and even the beautiful illustrations that you see are done by women-led businesses and young women in particular. And so for us, that was actually one of our recommendations. Let's start to actually look at how do we spend our money as a society, as institutions and organizations, and put a gender equity or racial justice lens on that as well. So the plan has 8 pillars and 27 recommendations, many inspired and aligned with the Hawaii plan as well. So I won't go into too much detail here, but I'm happy to answer in the Q&A. All of it is on feministrecovery.ca if people want to look further. What I did want to highlight are some of the things that we thought was really important to inject into the public discourse in Canada. And so for us, a big piece of the puzzle was starting to talk about how do we measure success. Typical economic indicators look at things like GDP, look at things like job rates, but that is insufficient for the moment that we're in. We need to be looking at things like income inequality. Has that diminished since this pandemic has started, or making that a crucial part of whether or not we're actually in recovery? Similarly, are the jobs that are coming back, are they decent with good pay and benefits? So we need to start to unpack, what does success look like? We can't have a recovery in a climate of hate, fear, violence, racism. And so for us, compared to some of our other recovery plans in Canada that we saw, we explicitly talked about addressing gender-based violence, racism. We can't have a recovery if we don't talk about these issues. And I'll kind of skip to some of these parts, but what I did want to share is since the plan got launched in the end of July, we actually have seen the rhetoric and some of the recommendations that we put forward start to be implemented and taken up by the government of Canada. So like mentioned earlier by Rosie, a focus on an intersectional feminist recovery. The government is planning on putting out an action plan for women in the economy. And finally, after 50 years of organizing, we're actually seeing on the horizon the potential for a national early learning and childcare system in our country. So this is something feminists have been fighting for half a century. we are almost there, and that's what we're anticipating, hopefully in a couple of weeks with the federal budget. So we saw, for example, some money towards reskilling programs through a gender responsive lens. We saw also this idea of an early learning and childcare system. But for us, the devil is always in the details. So what I do want to share with the audience here is on April 19th, Canada is going to put out its first post-pandemic budget, or in the pandemic budget. So we're really hoping for investments in childcare, this action plan on women in the economy, and also a national action plan to end gender-based violence. Our country has not had it yet, but we think the pandemic is the perfect policy window to actually make this happen. So with that, I'll kind of end here, but I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you both so much. It's absolutely fascinating and inspiring to see how your activism has transformed, it's really had an impact on policy. And I suppose my first question as a political scientist is, how have you managed, both of you, to have had that kind of influence? What strategy did you employ to persuade politicians who perhaps are not committed to exactly the same agenda as you to adopt your policies and adopt your programs? As that fits so clearly with your last point, Anjan, perhaps you would like to start, and then I'll come to Cara.
I think it really goes back to the point, and Cara and her team's work really inspired us to think about this as well. We cannot have a recovery if we don't talk about women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. And I saw a question in the chat about two-spirit. So two-spirit refers to queer identities from diverse Indigenous communities here in Canada. So that is terminology that we use here in Canada to represent queer identities of Indigenous peoples. And so in terms of how do we actually get them to listen, and how do we actually get them on our side? The economic case is quite clear. It's actually mathematically impossible for Canada's economy, and I would imagine many countries around the world, if we don't actually support women's work, both paid and unpaid, and actually start to value that unpaid care work. And I really appreciated the term that Cara mentioned around socialized mothering, right? Really start to see about how do we actually build back care and community in our economy, right? It's become such an individualistic society, such a, profit-driven society. So I think we've been able to kind of demonstrate with some of the studies that have started to come out that actually when you invest in care, everything else prospers. So that's been some of our messaging there.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And Cara, would you like to follow up?
Sure. Well, I've said this at a number of times. One does not, like as the meme, the Lord of the Rings meme goes, one does not simply, ask for or implement a feminist economic recovery. It is threatening to, many different blocks of power, especially when we're talking about questioning growth and certain logics that underpin our economy. So, you really have to be building a base of power alongside your community, because there will not be that political will if there are, you're going up against some of the most powerful lobbyists in your state. So that's been really important, is to siphon our power as a state commission and validate what's happening in our communities, and filter resources to grassroots organizers. That's my number one thing. I'm not gonna lie, right? Sexism is the dominant ideology. There's a lot of deniability, just like there is with climate change, and it's a huge distraction. So we really need to train also across government to unlearn patriarchy, just very fundamentally. And we actually run a course in the state commission, we're a statewide government agency, and we run a course on unlearning patriarchy that we've had some really interesting folks go through. So it does help and has facilitated, I think, a lot of the interest in the plan.
Thank you so much. Actually, you've taken me there, Cara, to one of the questions that was on my original list, and actually reflects a question from Jennifer Holland in the Q&A around how do you negotiate the kind of role of state versus federal government, and how's that worked out for both of you? Cara, would you like to start?
I guess since I'm the bureaucrat, sadly, yeah. So, you know, a lot of change doesn't happen, unfortunately, without federal mandate at the state level. You know, government is very conservative. There is, you know, definitely a culture of no can, you know, finding ways to justify not doing very basic, what you would think would be basic progressive changes. So we have, I don't know if most of your audience is US or European based, I think European, but our system, you know, the federal government, we are subservient to their mandates, of course, but the state has a lot of power in terms of how we're, for example, spending the money. We have had a massive influx of life-changing funding that has come to the state, and we get to decide, right, how we use that, and that can build or it can buttress a new or old economy. And that money has also been channeled to the counties. And so local power should not be overlooked, because actually our counties have tens of millions of dollars that they've received as well, which can or cannot go to this effort.
Thank you. Anjan, would you like to follow on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this has been actually just the situation around childcare in Canada. So we always we always see each order of government say that part of their responsibility is actually what another order of government has to do, right? The federal government can't take a role, or the provincial or territorial governments can't take a role, or the municipalities can't do this. But what we've seen is that childcare, for example, is a multi-jurisdictional issue. So we need to be firing on all cylinders. So our work was really focused on the federal government, but since then, we've actually seen some interesting movements in provinces and territories. So we have YWCs in different parts of the country. And so what they've done is actually start to organize locally. So our YWCs in British Columbia have gone together and are briefing the province of British Columbia's public service to talk about, you know, when the federal government is starting to come to the table and will actually be, hopefully we'll see providing funding, can you actually work with them to deliver those services, right? Because the delivery is done at that provincial or territorial level. Same conversations are happening in the province of Alberta. Same things are happening on the East Coast. And so for us, it's been trying to figure out, so part of it has been just making the case for something like childcare or feminist economic recovery just undeniable. And that's what the report did. All the facts and figures are there in one place. You cannot deny that this is an issue. And guess what? We also have the solution. So what's the excuse, right? What is honestly the excuse? And so the next layer of the excuses is like, oh, it's in another jurisdiction. And so we've been trying to target those jurisdictions to figure out, like, how do we actually get Ontario online? So in Canada, one of our provinces does have a province-wide childcare system in the province of Quebec. And so we've started to take the lessons from that one province and see how we can apply that across the country, recognizing if there are any limitations, addressing that. And to us, you know, for me, I come from a public health background. We actually have a roadmap for this with our healthcare system in Canada. It started in the province of Saskatchewan, and then it spread across the country. So for us, why can't we do the same with childcare? So that's part of what we've been pushing out there. And we're actually starting to win the rhetoric war, if you will, because, you know, anytime you open a newspaper now in Canada, there's a story on gender that we didn't see 2 years ago, a year ago, right? And so I think that's just the power of organizing as well and addressing it on multiple stages. And I think just leveraging the power of media as well.
Thank you. It's something we care very passionately about at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, that childcare is core infrastructure. And you describe it as being obvious, and yet to many decision makers it isn't obvious. And this opportunity, in a way, that this terrible crisis has brought to people's attention, this incredible inequality in terms of distribution of care. And that leads me on to a question specifically for you, Cara. You received quite a lot of press attention for an out-of-office message that you had on, which I think many of our audience, including myself, although my children are a little bit older than you describe in your email, would relate to. You say, I'm due to patriarchy, I'm behind with emails. I hope to respond to your message soon. But like many women, I'm working full-time while tending to an infant and toddler full-time. According to Washington Post, the average length of an uninterrupted stretch of work time for parents during COVID-19 was 3 minutes, 24 seconds. Could you tell us a little bit about the reaction to that email?
Well, I didn't know that there would be the reaction that there would be. I mean, I had it up to here basically at that time, so it wasn't very calculated. But I have, I was right there in it with, I mean, my kids still don't have childcare. I'm on wait lists. That's America for you. And we're a year into the crisis, and I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. So it was unbearable. And it's unbearable also to be within government and see this culture of taming your voice. And I wanted to really make a statement that you can be radical, you can be a lawyer, and you can be a woman of color and a mother at the same time. And I felt a lot of pressure from the feminists in my head that, one of my favorite attorneys, Flo Kennedy, said, you have to rattle the cage. If you don't rattle the cage, nobody's going to know you're in there. And, I had to do that, it wasn't just for myself, but I knew that so many mothers were coming to us, with policies like you can't even have if your baby appears in Zoom, you could be fired. And this was just so unacceptable across the board that a statement like that was needed. And I thought, what better way than send it out in every single email? So yeah, there you go. I'm sure the governor was very annoyed, and everybody else in government seeing that, 100 times. But thanks for asking.
Well, it certainly has had a huge impact. And I suppose this question's for both of you, but Anjum, if you'd like to take it first. Being an activist, fighting this fight over and over and over again takes a lot of courage and strength to keep going, to be prepared to take the backlash if you do put an out of office message on of that kind. How do you remain hopeful and positive? How do you keep that energy going?
I think it's honestly the communities that I'm part of and have the privilege of working with. And I think it's also celebrating the successes along the way, like realizing that this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. I think for us, when we saw in one of the government documents a couple months after our plan was released, actually using and echoing our language of intersectional feminist recovery, we knew that's something we should acknowledge. That was a contribution that we provided as members of civil society, and then also be loud about it. So then they also know on the end of government that when you take a positive direction, keep going. But also if you start to kind of roll back, we will be watching, right? And really leaning into the civic engagement of it. Because for us, this is something that generations of feminists have fought for. A more just society, an economy that actually works for us. And so in many ways, I see it as kind of picking up the baton from where we were before. And hopefully by the end of this pandemic, the legacy will be that we have a more feminist, intersectional minded or grounded society. And so that is what keeps me going. But I think also seeing others actually resonate. We've actually seen people who have never talked about these issues in Canada actually start to talk about the care economy in a way that I think is showing us that we are making a difference in terms of demonstrating that this is an issue that is not just an individual issue. This is something that impacts us all. And I think that's what the pandemic has done. It's binded us in this common experience, but I'm hopeful that's also raised the political consciousness of people who never thought about these issues in the same way before.
Thank you, Clara.
Yeah, I mean, in government, speaking from my position, there's an incentive not to do work. The more work you actually do, or the more effective, the more heat you're going to get. And it's actually worse for your career, I would say. So, people get beat up too many times and they just stop, right? Or they learn their lesson once and they stop. But, for me, when you go into government, you have to go in with a commitment to fight. You cannot let go of that commitment, and you have to surround yourself by people who are going to say, we're not going to support you if you're not, if you're not delivering for us, if you're not actually, changing the material conditions of working women's lives, then that's it. And that's who you're loyal to. You're only loyal to, you have to really decide who you're going to be loyal to. And for me, that is my ancestors, and that is my children, and that is women in the community that I grew up with, and that's it. And I'll land wherever. But you have a duty to yourself. You have a duty to yourself to deliver a life worth living, worth enjoying now, not for the next generation. And we have to do that not just for ourselves, right, but for our community and also for the earth. I mean, this is really tied up, you hear a lot of, ecofeminism reemerging, which is so true because it's rooted in the same ideology. So that's what really keeps me going. I think I do want to recognize every woman on this event who's not speaking, because I think that's one of the things that's not seen. People they see all this other stuff, but they don't see the harassment, the risk to your jobs constantly, the blowback, and the violence, frankly, of being, on the front line for women. It is really something that's difficult to describe and hard to believe if you're not in it. But I just want to, give a shout out to every woman here doing that work, because it is not easy and it's pretty invisible to most people. So in sisterhood, that's my answer.
It's very inspiring perspectives. Thank you. I'm going to move on to questions from the audience because the Q&A is absolutely on fire. So I'm going to start because it comes very nicely from your last point, Cara. Lisa Dando says, can you both give some examples of any concrete practical successes that you've seen made, I know it's early days, but seen made significant differences to women's lives as a result of these economic recovery strategies? Who would like to take that first?
So definitely still early days, but I will say for us, it was a positive step to see $100 million towards the Feminist Response and Recovery Fund. And that was targeted towards women's rights organizations, intersectional feminist groups, and other groups that are on the front lines. And the focus of that fund was on systemic change. So they just actually on March 25th, just wrapped up the kind of call for funding, if you will. So we'll see what decisions get made, how that'll be rolled out. But that was positive. And I think that's something where, that's something I would encourage other orders of government to do similarly. We want to see that at different cities across Canada, different provinces and territories. So I think that was just important, just that particular investment. We need more, of course. Something else that we have been pushing for close to a decade in Canada has been a national action plan to end gender-based violence. So we are anticipating in the upcoming budget, there will be money and actually a push towards a real plan, an implementation plan this year. It's unfortunate that we haven't had it for this long, but that I hope is one of the legacies of this time, that we actually all collectively understand we can't have economic security without personal security, without addressing all forms of gender-based violence. And I did want to pick up on a point that Cara mentioned, just around hate and harassment. And one of the things we've seen during this time is how that has accelerated online, because our entire life is online now, right? It's the virtual square. So for us, we've been really raising the issue that this is also going to infringe on women's ability to participate in leadership and in public discourse and in society if we don't address this as violence that it is. So later in a couple of weeks, we're anticipating online hate legislation in Canada to kind of address online hate, but also put more pressure on social media companies to start to kind of reduce and eliminate that hate online. But we're hoping that these conversations that we've started in the pandemic create that systemic change. And we're seeing a couple here with funding, policy, and I think in a way, a cultural shift as well in society.
you. I just would like to jump back on one of the comments that you made. A colleague, Laurel Weldon, a Canadian academic who's at Simon Fraser University, has done some research for the Gates Foundation that's shown that core funding for grassroots feminist activism around the world is an explanatory factor for actual real reductions in violence against women. So it's rather than project-based, giving organizations money that they can decide what to do with is really transformative. So just thought I'd mention her fantastic work. And Cara, would you like to follow on?
I don't, I have a lot of specific examples, but I don't have, just capturing Anjan's overview. We're right in the thick of it. We're trying to fend off existential threats in terms of funding. Meanwhile, we have an infusion of funding. I mean, we're sitting on like $30 million unspent just from the very first federal stimulus just for childcare. But it's a matter of getting a plan on how that's going to be invested. Will it just go into funding this broken system that we had of private providers, or are we going to set up an infrastructure to the extent that we can? So those questions are still up for, open. And we have a unique system in Hawaii. We have a part-time legislature, and we didn't have a legislative session the entire last year of COVID. It basically shut down when COVID hit. And so this whole time we haven't had the opportunity to implement our plan in state law because of that. So that's just some of the logistics. But, most of COVID, we were under Trump. And we were on our own. We had to fend for ourselves, basically out here in the wilderness, right? We had some money, but it was really up to us to save our own population. We didn't even, we basically had to compete for PPE and order PPE on Amazon, like the state. And so you can imagine, just like the ways that played out for gender too. So we are in the middle of the fight. Some of the good things that we've seen, though, besides the funding and committing the funding and shaping the funding towards women, are out of our community too. Some of the co-authors of the plan, for example, they have got pressured hospitals to change their COVID policies for women for most of the pandemic. Even dad, if dad was in the picture, was not allowed to be at the birth. No birth assistance, masks were required for women and birthing people in labor. Just all sorts of inconsistencies and bad practices that weren't necessarily necessary at all. So that's been changed from folks on our team. They have a mobile unit that's going around the islands for the first time, delivering care to moms, things that I'm sure you all have, but are really like groundbreaking in the US context. I'll stop, but yeah, that's we have more, but we're in the middle of it right now.
I wouldn't say that this isn't an experience that's familiar elsewhere, although in the UK we have got the NHS and state funded available healthcare. It's also true that partners were not ever able to attend births, and that obviously created a lot of trauma for a lot of people. I've got another question here from Sasha Roseneal. She says, could you both say something about how you seem to be holding together successfully such a range of different interests and feminist political positions? How are you managing that, Anjan?
I'm not sure. I hopefully I am, or we are as an organization. I think that is one of the things that we said when we put out this feminist economic recovery plan, is that this is not going to be the be all end all. We will be limited by our limited kind of just understanding of the world, because we are all growing towards a more progressive vision of feminism. However, we saw this as a starting point to create the dialogue, to create the space for our advocacy to thrive. Because part of the challenge initially in the pandemic was even just registering for the broader public that there was a gendered impact, that there were intersectional impacts. As a year later, that is now quite clearly part of the public consciousness in Canada. However, now we need to actually see action. And I think part of it is, there's so many different things. Like, for example, within our plan, we did not talk much about environmental ecofeminism because that's not something that we were as experienced in. However, our work is in complementary to that work, right? For us, the care economy is also a form of low carbon work. And so for us, part of it was, our contribution to the world. But since that plan has come out, our colleagues in the province of British Columbia have put out their version of a feminist economic recovery plan for their province. Our colleagues in Ottawa have put out a feminist economic recovery plan for the city, right? And so I think what we were trying to do has started to happen for folks to take this as a frame and localize it and ground it in their expertise. But the fact is, I guess the central message is that how we did things before was not working for us. So we need to do something different. And this is one of the ways that we can center the communities most affected. I do want to share one piece that we haven't heard enough about in Canada, and that's actually going to be kind of the next phase of our work, which is around the experiences of young people during this pandemic. So in Canada, 2.5% of our workforce are Gen Z women, but they suffered 17% of the economic losses. And so for us, we're really looking at this now as we don't want a lockdown generation. We really need to support some of our youngest generations in their pursuit of their life. And so that's something that we're working on this year as like a follow-up. And so for us, that's something, we didn't tackle enough in the first kind of this initial plan. So that's, it's going to be consistently building on the work. But now we have a foundation, we have an opening, so we're going to leverage it as much as we can.
Cara.
If I understand the question correctly, so it seems like there's a lot of different, you're talking about, basically green jobs and care infrastructure, and there's all these, different pieces to it. But it's really actually only one thing. For us, it is about how we get to a classless society, because women were that first class, and under any type of economy that's producing these strata that can be inherited and accumulated, then women will not be women will not be free, and women will not be liberated. And so for us, there's a lot of different ways that can happen, and ideas around that, but it is one thing. And that is, again, why we wanted to focus on the idea of confluence, because seeing capitalism as separate from patriarchy is ahistorical, and we will be really disoriented if we think of it that way. And so we wanted to just, again, focus on really one unifying plan and vision and message with different ways to make it happen.
So I'm going to take a question from an anonymous attendee now. She says, as a young civil servant in a male-dominated field, I'm often the only woman in the room. What advice would you have for people like me who try to centre women in work, or argue for reframing of policy by centering women, who are met with claims that gender's got nothing to do with it? You're both nodding. You've both definitely got replies. Ansham?
Yeah, so I'll just start. I think this is often the refrain that, what we're calling for is unattainable, unrealistic, doesn't make sense, right? And that in itself is a form of, systemic sexism and racism in knowledge production, right? And what is valued and what is prioritized. And even, sometimes there is such a big focus on quantitative numbers. I've been spitting out a lot of statistics, but even that, right? Like lived experience has told us all of these things in many ways, right? So I think I just want to kind of mention that, there's a reason why there is like this dismissing, because it is threatening, as Cara has mentioned in her previous statements. I would say, and it depends on the kind of ministry or the kind of government or country, but for us in Canada, it often helps to actually look at other countries and see what they're doing and say like, hey, they're doing that in Hawaii. We can do it here in Canada. And I will say that in itself was such an important opening for us in demonstrating the potential applicability in our country because it's been done somewhere else, right? So I'd say like, take these two reports, but all the other reports that have come out during this time, and the proof is there. So that I hope helps to push the agenda forward. I think part of it is also making alliances and connections across ministries and starting to be co-conspirators, right? Thinking about how can we kind of leverage different strategic moments. And I think that could be part of the puzzle as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly, I resonate really with this question, of course. I know exactly what you mean. Patriarchy, we are born into patriarchy and it is everywhere. And even if we, can organize and consciousness raise outside of the home, once we get back into the home, we're just overwhelmed by it. It's not a safe place and it's a place of indoctrination too. And so how do you counter that? It's different. It's a different animal. But for the gift of male privilege, right, is oblivion, or any privilege. And so, not being able to see how gender impacts our life every single day. I mean, you can just start interrogating that and it quickly falls apart, but it's so widespread. It's not just about, sexist man here, sexist man there, that it really will take systemic retraining. The way that Hawaii, I mean, they had to train patriarchy into us. Under my parents' generation, Hawaii was still classified by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory. That was in my parents' lifetime. And so, we have this awareness, and there's a lot of documentation of the way that these roles had to be trained in by the Minister of Public, Information. Women belong in the home. There were advertisements in Olelo, Hawaii, telling women like, this is the right role. This is what you need to be doing. So that was all constructed. And so there is a process to deconstruct that and to create a new culture. I already, gave a plug to our Unlearning Patriarchy class, but what we really do is that we put everyone in the position of matriarchy. So basically the whole first lesson is about experiencing what, what could be the opposite of patriarchy. And it really rattles people. It really shakes them up. And I would suggest it as a more systemic thing so that people at least can't say that it doesn't exist.
The questions are absolutely full of how inspiring the two of you are. And I hopefully you've been able to scan through that and see that. We literally have 2 minutes left, and rather than wasting it listening to me thank you, I think you can tell that I'm really thrilled with it, that you've joined us and that you've shared all of your insights and your activism. Could you take 1 minute each to tell us about someone who's inspired you and why? Whoever wants to go first, because I'm putting you on the spot. And we've already heard a bit about this, but just one inspirational individual. Ready? Oh, we've got Andrew.
I can't, absolutely my parents, they immigrated to this land. I immigrated with them, and just how difficult it's been for them just to create a life for us and our family. My dad is an essential worker. He is actually working in a workplace right now that just got an outbreak of COVID, right? And luckily, like later, I'm hoping this week he's going to get a vaccine, but he has seen what has not been working in society, and he has also been the first activist in my life, along with my mother, and just thinking about how we can create more economic opportunities for newcomers like him, right? And so I think about their sacrifice. I think about what they've instilled in me and my Muslim upbringing of making every place that you're part of better than when you leave it. So I think that's been my inspiration throughout this time. So
thank you so much.
If you're going to ask two people raised in immigrant households, they're always going to say their family. There's no doubt about it. So same with me. I mean, my grandmother, Naomi Habola, doesn't get as much credit in that, in that narrative of, they sacrificed everything and who brought the family to America and made the bigger sacrifice, right? But it was most definitely her. keeping the family together, and who has shaped my analysis and made certain things that I hear, you know, being put out, like valorizing domestic work and this is great work for women. And that doesn't resonate with my community or the experience of my grandmother, who was absolutely outraged at having to wipe literal white people's asses to make it, you know, that there's no dignity in servility. And so that really shapes me, that inspires me and to keep going. But also just the fact that immigrants, the role of the immigrant is to imagine a future that everyone is telling you is impossible, and to then engineer that to survive. And that is what we are called to do. And that is what I am called to do. And, you know, they are so much braver than I am. Like, I'm not putting my whole life on the line like that. And so that's the bar. That should be all of our bar. And it is worth it for the future generation.
Well, thank you both so much for inspiring us and uplifting us at this time when I'm sure all of the audience could do with it. And here's to a feminist economic recovery for everybody. Thank you all. Thank you so much.